Our next session for today touches upon a very, very critical topic. General Prasad spoke about the war in various parts of the world, and also the fact that the world has seen non-alignment, it has seen flexible alignment, and it has seen opportunistic alignment. The Ukraine war has in fact created further polarization in international politics. And we sometimes see strange bedfellows and certain opportunistic partners. India has been playing an important role, and its current role as the leader of G20 comes at a time when the world is looking towards India to broker peace and create harmony in a world full of strife. It is perhaps not entirely a coincidence that the foreign ministers of G20 nations have also been deliberating on these topics. While the foreign ministers may have their compulsions to be diplomatic, we are looking forward to a no-holds-barred panel discussion from our esteemed and very knowledgeable panelists today. So we have three panelists for this session on polarization and neutrality in the security environment. Yeah, Professor Brahmachalani, Mr. Ramanathan Kumar, and Mr. Pankaj Saran, please may I have you on stage? आप आ जाइए ऊपर हाँ So let me take the opportunity to introduce the panelists. Professor Brahmachalani is a geostrategist, scholar, author, and commentator. He brings a rigorous and interdisciplinary lens to global strategic issues, including natural resource geopolitics. He is presently Professor of Strategic Studies at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow of the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, and an affiliate with the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London. He has served as a member of the Policy Advisory Group, headed by the Foreign Minister of India. Before that, he was an advisor to India's National Security Council, serving as convener of the External Security Group of the National Security Advisory Board. As a specialist on international strategic issues, he has held several important appointments, including a fellow at the Nobel Institute in Oslo. His numerous peer-reviewed papers have been published in major journals, and he is also the author of 9 books. Professor Chalani has received a PhD in Strategic Studies. And Mr. Ramanathan Kumar retired as Special Secretary in the Research and Analysis Wing, India's external intelligence agency. A career foreign intelligence officer, his areas of specialization are counterterrorism and security-related issues in India's neighborhood. Our third panelist today is Ambassador Pankaj Saran. He is a former diplomat with 40 years of experience in foreign, strategic, and national security affairs. He has served in key positions within the Government of India, in the Prime Minister's Office, the National Security Council's Secretariat, Ministry of External Affairs, and in Indian missions abroad. He has served as India's ambassador to Russia from 2016 to 2018 and India's High Commissioner to Bangladesh from 2012 to 2015. He has served in different capacities in the Prime Minister's office under 5 different Prime Ministers for 9 years between the period 95 to 2012, contributing to decision-making at the highest levels in a diverse range of sectors. From 2018 to 2021, he served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Affairs under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, dealing with regional and global strategic formulation. Ambassador Pankaj Saran is presently convener of NatStrat, a Delhi-based independent center for research on strategic and security issues, and a commentator on security and strategic issues. So, without much ado, I hand over to Professor Brahmachalani. Would you like cordless mics and keep sitting, or whichever way you like?
Thank you very much for that introduction. When I looked at that topic of this session, I wasn't clear as to what this topic was about. First, I thought it was about India, internal security. Was it about external security? So I asked General Shankar Prasad to clarify, and he said it's about the global conflict over the war in Ukraine. So my short presentation will be focused on this conflict. And what I'll do is to provide just a broad overview and leave it to my fellow panelists to get to the nitty-gritty of this conflict. International competition and conflict are inherent in our world, given the fact there is no supranational government to enforce international law or to protect the weaker states from the more powerful states. If you look back at history, we have never been free of international conflict. Never. In other words, international conflict is endemic to international relations. Just looking at the history of the last 25 years, there have been a number of invasions of sovereign states by major powers. Today, we may focus on the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and forget even the more recent history. If you start from the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, which continued for nearly 3 months in 1999, then look at the number of invasions that followed. The invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and now Ukraine. So Ukraine is not an isolated case, but part of a pattern that we have been seeing for a long time. And when a major power invades a sovereign state, often that invasion tends to be, not always, but often tends to be long and bloody. When NATO intervened and overthrew Gaddafi, even that operation lasted 7 months or more. And it left Libya as a failed state. Libya is still not recovered. It's still a failed state, with no government in charge. And if you look next 25 years ahead, we can easily conclude that the next 25 years will not be fundamentally different from the last 25 years in terms of the powerful states violating the sovereignty of weaker states, either by invading them outright or by coercing them through various means, including through the use of sanctions as a weapon. The harsh truth about international law is this: international law is powerful against the powerless, but powerless against the powerful. I repeat, international law is powerful against the powerless, but powerless against the powerful. States that have been invaded in the last 25 years alone have generally been left destabilized. Some, as I said, have been reduced to failed states. Ukraine will not be any different. The Ukraine that we will see in the coming years will be a partitioned Ukraine, destabilized, and a hotbed of great powers. It will not be the same Ukraine that existed before the war. But there's a very important question that we often don't ask. Given the fact there has been a trail of invasions of sovereign states by major powers, how come this particular invasion of Ukraine is having a global impact? Why didn't the US/NATO invasions of other sovereign states have global impacts? There was no global impact when the Americans invaded Iraq. There was no global impact when NATO intervened in Libya and overthrew Gaddafi. So what makes Ukraine so unique, this invasion? It's important to understand why this is a unique situation, for 3 reasons. First, unlike the invasions that we saw earlier, this invasion from the word go, has become a proxy war between Russia and the NATO powers. So when we talk about this war between Russia and Ukraine, it's not really a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and the NATO powers that are using Ukraine as a surrogate, but not putting their own soldiers in harm's way. There can't be a better war for the NATO powers than to put all their military might behind a surrogate without bringing their own soldiers in harm's way. That's one reason. But there are two other reasons that even offer a better explanation for the global impact that we are seeing from this war. More than the war, it's the European Union's decision to switch energy supplies, energy imports from Russia to sources elsewhere, which has triggered a lasting global impact and also triggered an international energy crisis. For long, Europe relied on cheap Russian energy to power its growth. But now it's turning its back. In fact, it has already turned its back on cheap Russian energy. It is sourcing costlier supplies from elsewhere. So when German government boasts in public that now their imports of energy from Russia are zero, they don't tell their people at what cost the switch has happened. After all, it's the taxpayers who are paying for this switch. They were getting cheap energy, and now they are paying much dearer, paying for much dearer energy imports. But the troubling aspect about this for the rest of the world, and we saw what happened in Sri Lanka, the economic collapse in Sri Lanka about a year ago, is that when energy prices skyrocket, this has an impact on food production because 30% of the cost of food production is energy related. It has a cascading effect on economies. It triggers hyperinflation, and then it triggers recession. It's not a coincidence that Europe today is facing the specter of a recession, and that the world too, especially the low-income countries, the poorer countries, according to the IMF, 2/3 of them today face dire financial stress. This is all related to not just the war, to Europe's major energy switch away from cheap Russian energy, entirely for geopolitical reasons, to punish Russia. Nothing to do with economics, nothing to do with morality, no. It has only to do with geopolitics, to punish Russia. The third reason why we're having a global impact is that Russia enjoys a unique status as the world's richest country in natural resources. The sheer size of Russia is one reason why it is so resource rich. As you know, there are 24 time zones in the world. One country alone, Russia, covers 11 of the 24 time zones. I once flew from Helsinki to Tokyo. That flight was a little over 13 hours. 11 hours were over Russian territory. If you fly in India from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, the flight time is not more than 3 hours. But in Russia, if you go fly west to east, it takes more than 11 hours. That's the size of that country. Russia is a mineral powerhouse. Before the war, it was the world's largest energy exporter. Its fertilizer exports, the world's largest, remain critical to global food production. In fact, Russia is also the largest exporter of a number of other commodities, from wheat to rare metals. So when you impose sanctions, an unparalleled sanctions of a kind that have never been imposed on a state by Western powers, obviously there will be a global impact because there will be disruption in supplies. Unfortunately, what has happened that even commodities that are not on the sanctions list, their supplies are being affected because of the sanctions-related difficulty of making payments into Russia. If you can't pay for your imports, how can you import anything from Russia? So, about a couple of months ago, the US State Department was offering letters of comfort to Western importers, urging them to import things from Russia that are not on the sanctions list. But those letters of comfort did not help because you have imposed such financial sanctions on Russia that you cannot make payments into Russia. So how do you import? So even supplies of non-sanctioned commodities from Russia, their supplies have been disrupted. So for example, titanium is one example. And on top of that, we had Russia for some time blocking Ukraine's exports, and Ukraine's leading exports are three. In this order, sunflower oil is the leading export, followed by corn, then by wheat. Of course, Russia then eased that blockade, and Ukrainian exports are now flowing. But again, turning to the bigger picture, it's important to remember one thing, that the world today is at a crossroads, with its future direction looking somewhat uncertain. Despite globalization, the world is becoming more divided politically. The UN Secretary General some time ago warned of, quote unquote, colossal global dysfunction. The specter of global dysfunction is real. It's real because of the global impacts that we are seeing from this proxy war between Russia and the NATO powers. When we think of war, we normally think of a winner or a loser from a war, right? But from this war, whether the party is involved directly or indirectly in this war, from this war, no winner will emerge. No winner will emerge. They'll be all losers. Ukraine is going, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be left badly destabilized and partitioned. Russia will be a loser, though it has sustained the war for more than a year. You know, India cannot fight a war for more than a few weeks. Even today, we don't have that industrial and military capability to fight a war. But Russia has sustained a major military offensive, taking on the might of the NATO for more than a year, and it's in no mood to relent, no mood to cease operations. So it has that capacity to sustain a long war. But Russia is not, is a loser. It is a loser in several ways. Europe is a loser because Europe is bearing the brunt of the economic and geopolitical fallout from this war. And in the long run, a destabilized Ukraine will be a major concern for European security and European well-being. But even today, the fact that, look at the gas prices in Europe, they've gone through the roof. The cost of living has risen in Europe significantly. So Europe is already paying a heavy cost because of this conflict. And as far as the United States is concerned, it will also be a loser, even though its energy companies today are reaping a windfall. The curbs on Russian energy exports have opened new markets for American energy exporters, especially to Europe. LNG exports from the US to Europe have boomed, and the major gas and oil companies of the US are reaping a windfall. Yet, what's happening is that this conflict is bringing Russia and China, which are not natural allies, they're natural competitors. This conflict is bringing the two together and even helping to cement a Sino-Russian axis. Now, that's not in America's interest, right? That actually, such an access will further accelerate America's relative decline. So, eventually, America will come out as a loser from this conflict. There's a famous Indian children's tale, a Panchtantra tale of two cats and a monkey. Two cats and a monkey. Two cats were fighting over a cake. And a monkey came quietly and ate up the whole cake. The moral of the story that we are taught to children, that we teach to children, is that when you quarrel and fight, someone else gains. Now, in this present scenario, the two cats are obvious. You have Russia and the US fighting over Ukraine's future. But guess who's the monkey in the picture? Any guess? Sorry? Taiwan? China, of course. Of course. The monkey in the picture is China. Only China can gain from this conflict. The longer this conflict lasts, the more it will empower and embolden China, which is where India's security will come under pressure. Let me give you two reasons why China is the likely monkey in this picture. First, the US-led sanctions on Russia are one of the biggest gifts American policymakers have ever delivered to China. They have put the world's richest country in natural resources in the pocket of a resource-hungry China, including allowing Beijing to dictate the terms of the bilateral relationship with Moscow and seek greater access to sensitive Russian military technology. You may have read in papers how China has effectively become Russia's bank, because now Russia has switched to yuan as the major currency for its trade. So effectively, China is Russia's banker today. There's another reason why Russia is the likely only winner from this conflict. China is reaping a double bonanza from this conflict, double energy bonanza. First, Europe's energy switch away from Russia to costlier supplies from elsewhere has allowed China to start building what it calls an energy safety net. What is an energy safety net, according to China? It is boosting imports of Russian oil and gas via pipeline, that is through the land route. The land route, unlike seaborne supplies, cannot be interdicted, those supplies cannot be stopped by hostile naval forces, even if China were to invade Taiwan. This is significant because now the specter of Taiwan becoming the next Ukraine is troubling even American policymakers and American analysts. So here is China very consciously building what it calls an energy safety net through overland energy pipelines, thus ensuring that even in the event of a Taiwan conflict, the US and its allies will not be able to interdict energy supplies to China. So that's one energy bonanza. The second energy bonanza relates to Iran. After the Americans imposed sanctions on Iran, energy sanctions on Iran, India timidly halted all imports from Iran. Our imports from Iran now, oil imports are zero, right? But one country didn't bow to American pressure. It has become virtually the exclusive buyer of Iranian oil at heavy discount, and that's China. But since the war in Ukraine began, Iran has been forced to further discount its oil supplies to China so as to compete with Russian supplies in the Chinese market. Russia is selling oil and gas to China at a heavy discount. So Iran has been forced to further discount its already cheap energy exports to China. In other words, China is reaping a double energy bonanza. That's the reason why. There is the looming fear that Taiwan could become the next Ukraine. And if Taiwan becomes the next Ukraine, you can be sure about one thing: the global impact will be far worse than what we have seen from the Ukraine war, because Taiwan is even a bigger issue for international economy and international geopolitics than even Ukraine. It is the semiconductor hub of the world, for example, and its absorption forcibly by China will firmly end America's global preeminence. So it will have a huge global fallout. Now, of course, here one has to, I have to put in a caveat that unlike the full-fledged attack that Russia launched on Ukraine, the Chinese way of aggression is very different. In the Chinese way of aggression, three things matter the most. Three elements: stealth, deception, and surprise. Stealth, deception, and surprise has characterized every Chinese aggression since the Chinese communists grabbed power in 1949. Whether it was the occupation of Tibet, the war on India, 62, the invasion of Vietnam, 1979, or the annexation of the different islands it has, done since the mid-1970s. These three elements have always characterized Chinese aggression. If and when China were to attack Taiwan, you can be sure about one thing: it won't be a Russian-style full-fledged attack on Taiwan. Because first, China doesn't have that capability, amphibious capability, to invade Taiwan and grab it. No. What it will do is it will throttle, strangulate Taiwan slowly. How will it do it? It demonstrated that capability last August, a few months ago, when it carried out full-fledged military maneuvers, exercises around Taiwan, that it will enforce in the first go, when it attacks Taiwan, it will enforce a sea and aerial blockade of Taiwan. Taiwan depends on energy imports. Without that, its economy cannot survive. So a shipping blockade will begin the strangulation of Taiwan. So when I say Taiwan could become the next Ukraine, what I mean is not exactly in the Russian way of attacking a country. But let me now conclude, because I've spoken enough, but I think I need to draw two broad conclusions. The first is that one can safely conclude that our world will not be free of international conflict in the coming years, because the vision of international peace is a utopian vision. It's never been realized in the past. It won't be realized in the future. When I say this, I don't mean to endorse conflict. I'm simply stating a fact that international relations are not about morality. They are about gaining relative advantage. All the important states in the world compete to gain relative advantage. The second conclusion is that unlike the wars of the past, for example, Japan's war with Russia, 1905, where Japan made major strategic gains, or China's occupation of Tibet, which eliminated a huge buffer that India had with China in 1950-51. Unlike those wars of the past, wars of recent decades have largely been characterized by one thing: they have tended to backfire on the aggressor. They have tended to backfire. And I'll give you some examples so that you have an idea of what I mean. Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, then he invaded Kuwait, and he lost big both times. The Americans invaded Afghanistan and Iraq and got bogged down in very costly, endless military quagmires. The NATO intervened in Libya and turned that once peaceful, once prosperous state into a failed state from which there is still no prospect of recovery. Israel invaded southern Lebanon. And like the American invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon became a military quagmire for Israel that stretched for 18 years. 18 years. And when Serbia attacked, Kosovo, it eventually led to Milosevic's indictment as a war criminal and his removal from power. Or take the most recent example, China's stealthy land grabs in Ladakh of April 2020, 34 months ago. So in terms of territory, China may have emerged as a winner from its aggression against India. But if you look at it more broadly, more strategically, what China's aggression has done, it's turning India, its largest neighbor, into a permanent enemy and making an Indian military buildup inevitable. It's a replay of what happened in 1962. China won the war but lost the peace. If there had been no 1962 invasion of India, India still would have believed, as it did from 1947, that if you want peace, you will get peace. That was India's founding philosophy, right? We still teach children that India won its independence through the path of non-violence. That's the biggest founding myth. It's a founding myth of India because India did not win peace through the path of non-violence. Even in British colonies, where there was no independence movement, even in those colonies, independence came. There were other factors, but the notion that we had until 1962 was that if you want peace, you will get peace. So 1962 was a real wake-up call for India. In that sense, it helped remove the pacifist blinkers that India had for so many years after independence. The last thing about on this, on losers, that Russia invaded Ukraine, and as I pointed out earlier, it's going to be a loser. It's going to be a loser in a longer time frame. In the short time frame, for example, Putin has become more popular at home. If you look at it at his approval ratings at home, they're even higher than what they were before the war. Russia has created a buffer by grabbing nearly 1/5 of Ukraine in the east and the south. So again, like the Chinese aggression against India, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, territorially looking, if you just look at the territorial gains, would make Russia look like a winner. But from a larger, longer-term strategic viewpoint, Russia will be a loser. It will be a loser because of the enormous impact of the Western reaction, the Western sanctions on Russia. Those sanctions will not be significantly eased, even if there's a ceasefire tomorrow. There will be a ceasefire eventually. Same thing happened in the Korean Peninsula. Because today the war in Ukraine has reached a stalemate. And the grinding nature of the war underscores the fact that we have reached a stalemate. So when you reach a stalemate, what's the next thing? The next thing is you seek an armistice, a ceasefire. in the Korean Peninsula, in the Korean War, by 1951, July 1951, the war had reached a stalemate. But it took 2 years thereafter for an armistice to be achieved. And eventually what happened was that Korea was partitioned, a demilitarized zone was created. Same thing will happen in Ukraine. One doesn't know how long it will take. There will be an armistice. It will leave Ukraine, as I mentioned earlier, destabilized. But Russia will not recover for years to come from the impact of the Western sanctions. As far as the US is concerned, the Americans have nothing to be pleased about, because their intervention, the major intervention in the Ukraine war, is helping cement this Sino-Russian axis, which has long been Washington's security nightmare. And this war is turning China and Russia into major partners, and that eventually will contribute to the erosion of America's global preeminence. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning everyone. It's so nice to be here in the Vasant Vihar Club. It's a great atmosphere. To talk about war and peace is not actually very congruent with the atmosphere prevailing. But let me begin by saying that, normally economists never agree on anything. And that also applies to foreign affairs specialists. But in this case, I just have to say that I agree with almost everything which Brahmachalani has said. And it's not easy to dissect what's going on, but a lot of what he has said actually is really very, very accurate. Unlike him, I took the topic of the discussion much more literally. So I did a lot of research on polarization and neutrality. So I will maybe focus a little more on some concepts, going back, a little bit, and rather on and off to the Ukraine conflict. But I think he has actually spelt out almost all the dimensions of the conflict. Polarization is firstly something about the world. I think as India, a lot of what is happening, but the question for us is, what happens to us? What response do we prepare for what is going on? And how do we position ourselves in this whole thing? So I think polarization is something that has been accentuated significantly because of the conflict. It was always there, the East and the West. But this conflict has, for those of us who belong to that generation, a lot of the terminology, the language, and everything else reminds us of what we saw in the 60s and 70s between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that was really the extreme degree of polarization that we saw when the world was almost divided down the middle. The difference now, of course, is that the third actor has come onto the stage. And if I can continue with his analogy, I think the monkey is having the last laugh. Because, and we have to factor that in, that it's not just a bipolar world. In fact, the West had thought, and we had all thought, thankfully, that the Cold War had ended, that the Soviets had been defeated, the country had been broken up. But now it's all come back. And so there's a new generation of Indians and everyone else in the world who are saying, what happened? We thought you had won the war, but one fine day you're again at each other's throats. So that's the first thing, the resurgence of bipolarity coupled with the very, very significant footprint of the third party, which is China. On neutrality, it's part of the topic, but I just want to, share with you, as someone from the trade, that if you take the technical meaning of neutrality, it's not exactly what we understand in lay terms. Neutrality in the context of war and peace is a very technical term. So, if you think of which are the countries which are neutral, quote unquote, you'd probably think of Switzerland or maybe a country like Turkmenistan. And there are certain attributes of being neutral. And the first attribute is that you actually recognize that there are opposing alliances and you actively say, I will not be a party to any alliance, and I, in some ways, give guarantees that I will not be either a military partner or even a political partner. In fact, because of the whole problems in Afghanistan and even Ukraine, there is a lot in the literature which says that maybe Afghanistan, the only solution is to guarantee it neutrality. And even on Ukraine, there are people who are saying perhaps the only guarantee for peace is that we in some way or the other confer neutrality on Ukraine. But the other aspect of neutrality is that the two alliances must also believe that you're neutral. So just by your saying I'm neutral is not enough. I mean, everyone else has to believe what you say. So for example, in the case of Switzerland, if you talk to Swiss officials, the Russians are telling them you are no longer neutral. So that's on the neutrality part. I think if the topic intended to reflect on, say, the Indian position, a lot of our media and other writings loosely say that because India abstained, we have taken a neutral position. That's actually wrong, because abstention and neutrality are totally different. And so, words really do matter because they convey so much meaning. We abstained, but we did not be neutral. We took a very conscious decision to take a position because, we must remember that there are 4 kinds of votes in the UN. I mean, one is a yes, a no, an abstention, and the last is you don't even turn up for the vote. You excuse yourself from the vote. So on Ukraine, for example, there were a few countries who decided not to vote at all. But your act of abstention is an act of declaring a certain position. And that brings me to the next point, again on terminology. You would notice that the government of India, from the first day till today, has not used 2 words in the context of this situation. One is war, and the other is invasion. There is no single Indian government statement which has described what we are seeing as war. Nor has the government of India at any stage described what we are seeing as an invasion. The word basically used to talk about what is happening is conflict. And that by itself is a huge value judgment and indicates a very, very sophisticated approach to the Indian handling of this crisis. And that has actually pitted us against primarily the West, not so much Russia. But they are unhappy with the fact that we are not, quote unquote, with them. The difference, I think, today from where we were in the 1950s and 60s is that we are more experienced, we have more national power, we are also more vocal. So, in the context of, and the world is an unequal place. I mean, we have to begin with that presumption when we make policy. And number 2, morality is not the determinant of policy. Brahma has actually brought it out, was something I was planning to say. But there is no morality in invasions and wars. And when people invoke moral values, human rights, it's all, these are all tools to an end. These are not an end in itself. These are means to an end to promote certain strategic goals. So the question is, do we see this conflict on the face of it, or as an Indian, do I have maturity after 75 years of being an independent country to take my own call on what happened, why it happened, and what are my interests? And so he's brought out a few things about China, etc., which are very valid, and about Russia. So the choices before us are not very easy, but I would only say that we have to navigate this whole thing. If we are trying to look for clear answers, I don't think we will get them. Our economic interests tell us something, our political interests tell us something, our civilizational interests tell us something. There is a job here for us to merge all these interests and take a certain position. Question is whether we are going beyond polarity, or let us say, if you even talk, or let us say we discuss polarity, you could have a unipolar world, you could have a bipolar world, you could have a multipolar world. These all impact you. And the question always comes back to you as India is, do you see yourself as a pawn on the chessboard, or do you see yourself as a bigger player on the chessboard? If you take yourself as someone who accepts a given situation, that will dictate one set of choices, policy choices. But if you believe that you can actually make a difference, that will lead to another set of policy choices. I think in this particular case, what we are seeing is a mixture of both. So which is why I think it was in sheer frustration that India went and became somewhat of a spokesman for the global south. Because apart from some of the other reasons he mentioned, one of the other reasons why this has captivated our attention, at least of the Indian elite for the last 1 year, is that because it's Europe. I mean, Iraq has been bombed to hell. Libya doesn't exist. Syria is gone 30 years backwards. But no one bothers actually. And so has Afghanistan. But the question is, it's okay for sitting in Brussels and all to, believe that Ukraine is your primary threat. But from an Indian lens, it doesn't make sense. And we have to have our own Indian perspective on what is going on. And that internalizing that very basic point is the biggest challenge. Because the influence of mass media, the inequality of power in all senses of the term, do not help you to take an independent view. And if you take an independent view, you are seen as hurting one party or the other. And there is growing intolerance, particularly among the media and the strategic communities on both sides, to a view which does not correspond to their view. So when you stake out your position, which is different, I mean, there are many words you can use: a third path, the middle path, non-alignment, a balanced position, independent position. You can have books written on all these terminologies. But in the essence, I think the fact is that we will see a fractured world. And I don't want to repeat everything which Brahma has done. He's brought out the intricacies. But it's not going to be easy for us to navigate. But I think the message has gone across this time around, compared to the 50s and 60s and 70s, that this is a new India. I mean, we will not be cowed down by different levers of power to take a certain position. And the positions we have taken today are very, very different from the kind of quote-unquote non-aligned policies we took in the past. So maybe I'll just stop here because we can, it's probably better to just have a Q&A. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to General Shankar Prasad and to the Vasant Vihar Club for inviting me to this event. Like Mr. Chelani, I was also somewhat confused when the topic was suggested to me by General Prasad. He spoke to the organizers, I spoke to my good friend Ambassador Saran, and we decided that this is a delightfully ambiguous topic on which we can all have our say. But I think I'm also, it's said that, well, wise men think alike and fools seldom differ, etc., etc. But I think in our own ways, we all came to the conclusion that this would eventually be about the Ukraine conflict and its implications. And of course, Mr. Chelani has, I think, laid out a very eloquent exposition. And I broadly agree with virtually everything that he said, and also what Ambassador Saran said, particularly the analogy about the cats and the monkey, and what Ambassador Saran said about the job that we have at hand. This is where I might just perhaps strike perhaps a somewhat unusual chord. I'm not so sure. But I will say it because in my sort of the kind of profession or the background that I come from, I've always felt that it is the hard targets that have to be attacked, the hard issues that have to be addressed. And if you take it as a working hypothesis that the biggest sort of gainer in this conflict will be China or is China, then we come back to that basic issue as to how do we go about our sort of the problems that we have with China, particularly in the background of the developments that started in Ladakh in the summer of 2020. I would perhaps not agree fully with Mr. Chelani just on that limited point. It is possible, and I think so, that the Chinese, in their calculation, well, India has pushed back, but they have made a point, they have made their point, and we've had to put an additional number of 50,000 troops more in Ladakh. They have had to up their game, and we are both there. But perhaps they have also, in their scheme of things, they might well conclude that they have sort of stopped India in its tracks, as it were. Now, from my perspective, I think the two adversaries that we have in this polarized world, increasingly polarized world, remain the same, the neighbor to the east and the neighbor to the north. The one to the west and the neighbor to the north. The immediate neighbor to the west, as we all know, I think is facing an increasingly difficult situation, and I think the policy of death by 1,000 cuts, so the proxy war that they have been pursuing against us, might well become I think, increasingly difficult even for them with the passage of time, despite what is happening in the broader AFPAC region and the blowback from radical Islamic forces that Pakistan is sort of experiencing right now. I'm sort of cutting a long story short because we are nearing, I think, lunchtime, and perhaps we've also taxed the boundaries of your patience. So I will sort of just briefly focus on the northern neighbor for a moment. Ambassador Saran referred to, the differences how different the situation today is compared to the 1960s and the 1950s. Uh, that is absolutely true, and India is far more powerful, far more assertive, and far more confident. But in some ways, I would say that the hard decisions that we have to take vis-a-vis China on the security aspect, I think we have not done anything much bar kick the can further down the road. I talk of the long standing border dispute that we've had with China. That remains as much of a thorn in our flesh as it was at that point of time. And the real danger, to my mind, that I foresee from my sort of perspective, is that as a result of the developments in Ukraine and the outcome of this conflict could well be, in addition to Taiwan, China also gaining or entertaining ideas of repeating 1962 in some form or the other. It may not be exactly a 1962-like situation, but some form of some adaptation of that scenario. And I think that is what we really have to prepare for. And despite all the difficulties, I think to arrive at some kind of a modus vivendi with China on our boundary dispute, despite all the difficulties, I think will be our real challenge. I'll leave it at that, and anything else, I mean, as I agree that we can I would be happy to answer questions on what I've said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for giving us clarity on what was clearly a complex and, as you said, ambiguous topic. We would have loved to take some questions, but we are running seriously behind on our schedule. And our next speaker, Mr. Pawan Verma, is already here. So I would just request Girish Sareen to come up and hand over the mementos. But really, thank you so much, gentlemen. Very, very interesting point of view. Just a little token of appreciation from Vasant Vihar Club. You?